The flames ate through the canvas like a living thing, orange and vicious against the white landscape. And Margaret Jane watched everything she owned in this world turn to ash and smoke, while the blizzard howled around her like the voice of God announcing the end of days. She had been traveling alone for 3 weeks, making her way from Kansas City to meet her sister in California, carrying every possession, every memory, every cent she had saved working as a seamstress for 6 long years. The wagon had been her gamble, her chance at a new life, purchased with money that represented countless pricked fingers and late nights by candlelight. Now the wood crackled and popped in the snow, the wheels already blackened husks, and Margaret stood 20 feet away wrapped in the single blanket she had grabbed when the lantern tipped over. She did not know how it happened. One moment she was trying to light the small stove to make coffee as the snow piled higher around her camp, and the next the oil had spilled, the flame had caught, and everything erupted faster than she could think. The cold bit through the blanket within minutes. Margaret was 23 years old and had never felt so completely alone in her entire life. The snow fell thick and heavy, already covering the ruts her wagon wheels had made in the road. She could not see more than 30 feet in any direction. She had passed through a small settlement 2 days ago, but that might as well have been 200 miles in this weather. Her fingers were already going numb. She pressed them against her body, trying to think, trying to plan, but the shock kept pulling her thoughts apart like cotton wool. She should move. She should walk. But which direction? The road was disappearing under fresh snow, and the gray sky gave no hint of sun or direction. If she chose wrong, she would wander into empty plains and freeze to death within hours. If she stayed here, she would freeze anyway. The fire was already dying, the snow smothering it, and soon there would be nothing but smoking wreckage and her own body beside it. Margaret forced her legs to move. She stumbled toward the wagon, hoping something, anything, had survived. The heat hit her face, still intense near the center, but everything inside was gone. Her trunk of clothes, her sewing supplies, her food stores, her rifle, the small wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring and her father's watch, all of it consumed. She backed away, coughing from the smoke, and that was when she heard the hoofbeats. They came steady and sure through the storm, and Margaret turned to see a horse and rider emerging from the white curtain of snow like an apparition. The horse was a big bay gelding, and the man on its back sat tall in the saddle despite the wind that tried to knock everything sideways. He wore a heavy canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat tied down with a cord under his chin, and when he saw the burning wagon, he pulled up short. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Are you hurt?" Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. Now that someone was here, now that she was not alone anymore, something inside her threatened to break open entirely. The cowboy swung down from his horse in one smooth motion and came toward her, his eyes sweeping over her quickly, checking for injuries. He was young, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a clear gray, steady and calm despite the chaos of the storm and the fire. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret managed. "Good, we need to move now. My place is 3 miles south. You will not last an hour out here." He was already moving, leading his horse closer, not waiting for her to argue or explain. "What is your name?" "Margaret Jane." "Nathan Moss. Can you mount up?" Her fingers were too cold to grip properly, but Nathan did not hesitate. He put his hands on her waist and lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist, solid and warm even through the layers of clothing, and he pulled her back against his chest. "Hold on," he said, and kicked the horse into a steady trot. Margaret had no choice but to lean against him. The wind was brutal, driving snow into her face, and she tucked her head down. Nathan's body blocked some of the wind, and she could feel the heat of him even through his coat. The horse moved confidently despite the conditions, and she realized Nathan must know this land intimately to navigate it in a blizzard like this. "What were you doing out here alone?" Nathan asked after a few minutes. His voice was close to her ear, loud enough to carry over the wind. "Traveling to California," Margaret said. Her teeth were starting to chatter. "To meet my sister. Long way to go alone. I know." She did not have the energy to explain further, to tell him about her sister's letters begging her to come west, about the life she was leaving behind in Kansas City that had grown too small and suffocating. None of that mattered now anyway. Nathan did not push for more. He just kept the horse moving, one hand on the reins and the other arm firm around her waist to keep her steady. Margaret's sense of time fragmented in the cold and the monotony of the snowfall. It might have been 10 minutes or an hour before Nathan said, "There." She looked up and saw buildings emerging from the white. A ranch, she realized, with a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Everything was covered in snow, and more was piling up by the minute. Nathan guided the horse straight to the barn, and the relief of getting out of the wind was so intense that Margaret let out a small sound she could not quite control. "Easy now," Nathan said. He dismounted first, then reached up for her. Margaret tried to slide down on her own, but her legs buckled the moment her feet hit the ground. Nathan caught her before she fell, his hands strong and sure. "I have got you. Come on." He half carried her out of the barn and through the snow to the house. The door opened to a wall of warmth, and Margaret gasped at the difference. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, and the single room was clean and orderly. There was a bed in one corner, a table and chairs near the fire, shelves lined with supplies, and a stove along one wall. The floor was wood, not dirt, and everything spoke of a man who took care of his space. Nathan guided her to a chair near the fire and wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. "Sit there. Do not move yet. Let your body warm up slowly, or you will make yourself sick." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The warmth was almost painful on her frozen hands and face. Nathan moved with quick efficiency, adding wood to the fire, filling a kettle with water and setting it on the stove. He pulled off his coat and hat, and Margaret saw he was lean and strong, with broad shoulders and work-roughened hands. He moved like someone completely comfortable in his own skin, no wasted motion. "I need to see to my horse," Nathan said. "I will be back in a few minutes. There is coffee in that tin on the shelf if you want to make some when the water is hot." Then he was gone, back out into the storm. Margaret sat alone in the warm house, staring at the fire, trying to process what had just happened. Everything was gone. Her wagon, her belongings, her money that she had sewn into the lining of her trunk. She had nothing left except the dress she was wearing and the blanket she had grabbed. She was stranded in a blizzard with a complete stranger, dependent on his charity for her very survival. The reality of it crashed over her, and Margaret put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She felt too numb for tears. She just sat there, breathing, trying to think of what came next. Nathan returned a few minutes later, stamping snow off his boots. He hung his coat and hat on pegs by the door and came to check the kettle. "How are your fingers and toes? Any sharp pain?" "No, they ache, but not sharp." "Good. That means no frostbite." He poured hot water into 2 tin cups and added coffee grounds, then brought one to her. "Drink this. It will help." Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. The coffee was strong and bitter, but she drank it gratefully. Nathan pulled another chair close to the fire and sat down, drinking his own coffee and watching her with those steady gray eyes. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly, so Margaret told him. The whole story spilled out. The overturned lantern, the fire that spread too fast to stop, the complete loss of everything. Nathan listened without interrupting, his expression serious. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You are lucky to be alive," he finally said. "That storm is only going to get worse. If I had not been checking my northern fence line, I would not have been anywhere near that road." "Why were you out in this weather?" "I had cattle up that way. Needed to make sure they were driven to lower ground before the worst of it hit." He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Listen, Miss Jane, that blizzard is going to last at least 2 days, maybe 3. The road will be impassable for a week after that while the snow melts and the mud dries out. You are going to be here for a while." Margaret had already known that, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real. "I understand. I am grateful for the shelter. I will work to repay you however I can." "We can talk about that later." Nathan stood and moved to the shelves, pulling down a wooden box. "Right now we need to get you warm and fed. When did you last eat?" "This morning. I had some jerky and hardtack." "Not enough." He brought the box to the table and started pulling out supplies. Flour, salt, dried beans, a slab of bacon wrapped in cloth. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and bacon and biscuits. That will do for tonight." Margaret watched him work. His hands were deft and sure, clearly used to taking care of himself. He mixed biscuit dough and shaped it quickly, then set a cast iron pan on the stove and started slicing bacon. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger. She had been rationing her supplies carefully, trying to make them last until she reached the next settlement. Now all of that careful planning was ash and smoke. "I should help," she said, starting to stand. "Sit," Nathan said firmly. "You are still too cold. Warm up properly first." Margaret sat back down, unused to being ordered around but too tired to argue. She sipped her coffee and watched Nathan cook. There was something calming about his competence, the way he moved through the tasks without fuss or worry. He seemed like a man who had faced problems before and knew how to handle them. "How long have you lived here?" Margaret asked. 4 years. "I bought this land with money I saved working cattle drives up from Texas." He flipped the bacon in the pan. "Built most of the buildings myself. It is not much yet, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, and Margaret understood that. She had felt the same way about her wagon, the first thing she had ever owned outright. Now it was gone, and she was right back where she had started, with nothing. No, she told herself firmly. That was not true. She was alive. That was something. She would figure out the rest. Nathan served the food on tin plates, and they ate at the table. The bacon was salty and rich, the beans hearty, the biscuits hot and filling. Margaret had not realized how hungry she was until she started eating. Nathan ate steadily, putting away an impressive amount of food, and she remembered he had been out in the storm too, working in the bitter cold. "This is very good," Margaret said. "Thank you. Like I said, I am not much of a cook, but it keeps me going." Nathan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Tomorrow, when the light is better, I will see if there is anything left of your wagon worth salvaging. Sometimes the metal parts survive a fire. Might be able to sell them or trade them." "That is kind of you. Just practical." But his tone was not harsh, just matter of fact. "Out here, you do not waste anything. Every scrap of metal or wood has value." They finished eating in companionable silence. Margaret helped wash the dishes despite Nathan's protests, needing to do something useful with her hands. The domesticity of it felt strange and oddly intimate, washing dishes with this man she had met only hours ago. But there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows, and the fire crackled in the hearth. When the dishes were done and put away, Nathan pulled out a bedroll from a trunk. "You take the bed. I will sleep on the floor by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Margaret protested. "You have already done too much. Miss Jane, I am not going to argue with you. You have been through hell today. Take the bed." His tone left no room for discussion. Margaret was too exhausted to fight. She went to the bed, which was in the corner farthest from the door, and lay down fully clothed. The mattress was filled with straw and surprisingly comfortable, and the blankets were thick wool. Nathan moved around the room quietly, banking the fire and checking the windows. Then he lay down in his bedroll, his back to her, giving her what privacy he could in the single-room house. Margaret stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the fire. She should be terrified, she thought. She was alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere, completely at his mercy. But somehow she did not feel afraid. Nathan had been nothing but respectful and kind. He could have left her out there to die. He could have demanded payment she could not give. Instead, he had fed her and given her his bed and asked for nothing in return. "Mr. Moss," she said quietly into the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for saving my life." There was a pause, then Nathan said, "You are welcome. Get some sleep, Miss Jane. Tomorrow will be a long day." Margaret closed her eyes and, despite everything, fell asleep almost immediately. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Nathan moving around the house. Gray dawn light filtered through the windows, and the storm still raged outside, though maybe not quite as violently as before. Margaret sat up, feeling the stiffness in her muscles from the previous day's ordeal. Nathan was at the stove, cooking something in a pan. "Morning," he said without turning around. "I've got eggs and more bacon. Coffee is ready." Margaret got up and used the wash basin Nathan had set out for her, cleaning her face and hands as best she could. Her dress was wrinkled and smoke-stained, but it was all she had. She finger-combed her dark hair and pinned it up, trying to make herself presentable. Breakfast was simple and hot, and they ate while planning the day. Nathan needed to check on his livestock, which meant going out into the storm again. Margaret insisted on helping with what she could inside, and Nathan finally agreed to let her mend some of his clothes that needed attention. He brought out a battered sewing kit, and Margaret almost laughed at the sight of his crude stitching on a torn shirt. "I can fix this," she said. "And if you have other things that need mending, I can do those too. I was a seamstress in Kansas City. It is what I know." Something like relief crossed Nathan's face. "I've got a pile of things that need fixing. I am not good with a needle. Then we have a trade. I will mend your clothes in exchange for the food and shelter." Nathan nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But you are staying until the roads are clear regardless. I'm not sending anyone back out there until it is safe." He bundled up and went out to tend his animals, and Margaret set to work. The pile of mending was substantial. Shirts and pants with torn seams, a coat with a ripped lining, socks that needed darning. She settled by the fire with the sewing kit and got to work, her fingers moving in the familiar patterns. It felt good to be doing something productive, something she was skilled at. It gave her a sense of purpose beyond being a helpless victim of circumstance. Nathan came back an hour later, covered in snow, and hung his coat to dry by the fire. "Stock is fine. They are smart enough to shelter in the barn and the lean-to. We should be all right as long as the storm does not last more than 3 days. Will it? No way to know for sure, but I have seen worse." He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, watching her work. "You are fast with that needle." "I have been sewing since I was 6 years old. My mother taught me." Margaret tied off a thread and cut it. She said every girl should know how to mend and make, that it was the one skill that would never fail her. Smart woman. She was. Margaret picked up another shirt. "She died when I was 17, pneumonia." My father followed a year later. His heart, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. I am sorry, Margaret shrugged, trying to keep her voice steady. It was 6 years ago now. My sister Rebecca went west with her husband, and I stayed in Kansas City to work. But the city got too small, too lonely. When Rebecca wrote and said there was work in California, I decided to take the chance. What kind of work? She runs a boarding house in Sacramento with her husband. She said I could work there, help her manage the place. Margaret looked up from her sewing. At least that was the plan. Now I do not know. Roads will clear eventually, Nathan said. Might take a few weeks, but spring is coming. When it is safe to travel, we will figure something out. The simple certainty in his voice was reassuring. Margaret found herself studying him more carefully in the daylight. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and those calm gray eyes. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of hard work. He was exactly the kind of man she had imagined when she thought of the West, self-reliant, tough, competent. But there was also a gentleness in how he spoke to her, a respect that she had not always found in men. The days developed a rhythm. Nathan would go out morning and evening to tend the livestock, sometimes staying out for hours to repair storm damage or bring in more firewood. Margaret cooked and cleaned and worked through his entire pile of mending, then started on other tasks. She organized his supplies, discovering he had a surprisingly well-stocked pantry. She made bread from scratch, which earned her a look of genuine appreciation from Nathan when he came in for dinner. I have not had fresh bread in months, he said, breaking off a piece and eating it while it was still warm. This is really good. It is just bread, Margaret said, but she felt pleased nonetheless. Just bread, Nathan repeated, shaking his head. Miss Jane, you do not understand. Out here, little things like this make a big difference. Good food, mended clothes, a clean house. It matters. Margaret looked around the cabin. It did look better. She had scrubbed the floor and the table, organized the shelves, washed all the bedding and hung it by the fire to freshen. It felt like making a home, even though it was not hers and never would be. The thought gave her a strange pang. In just a few days, she had become comfortable here. Too comfortable, maybe. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Margaret woke to silence, and at first she thought something was wrong. Then she realized it was the absence of wind. She got up and looked out the window to see clear sky and blinding white landscape. Snow had drifted in places as high as the windowsills, and everything sparkled in the morning sun. Nathan was already up, standing by the door and looking out. It is over. I need to dig us out and check for damage. Then I will ride out to where your wagon burned and see what is left. Margaret dressed quickly and joined him. Together they shoveled a path from the door to the barn, and Margaret helped Nathan check on the animals. He had 3 horses besides the bay gelding he rode, half a dozen cows and some chickens in a small coop. Everything had survived the storm. After breakfast, Nathan saddled his horse and rode out. Margaret watched him go with a feeling she could not quite name. Worry, maybe, or loneliness. The cabin felt empty without him. He returned in the early afternoon, his saddlebags heavy. Found some things, he said, laying them out on the table. A few twisted pieces of metal that had been part of the wagon's frame, the metal rim of a wheel, and miraculously, a small scorched metal box. Margaret picked it up with shaking hands. It was blackened and dented, but intact. She opened it, hardly daring to hope, and there inside were her mother's ring and her father's watch, both tarnished but undamaged. She sat down hard, gripping the box. I thought these were gone. I thought everything was gone. Nathan said nothing, just put a hand on her shoulder briefly before moving away to give her space. Margaret held the watch and the ring, feeling the weight of them, the connection to her parents. It was not much, but it was something. It was a piece of her history that had survived. That night, they talked more than they had before. Nathan told her about growing up in Texas, the youngest of 4 boys, learning to work cattle from the time he could sit a horse. His father had been a hard man, demanding and sometimes cruel, and Nathan had left as soon as he was old enough to make his own way. He had worked drives for years, saving every penny until he had enough to buy this land and start his own place. "I want to build something that lasts," he said, staring into the fire. "Something that is mine, not my father's, not anyone else's, mine." "I understand that," Margaret said. "That is why I bought the wagon. It was the first thing I ever owned that was truly mine, bought with my own money. I worked 6 years for it, and it burned in one night." Nathan looked at her. "That is the thing about this life, Miss Jane. It can all disappear in an instant. Fire, flood, drought, raiders. You have to be tough enough to survive that, to lose everything and keep going. Are you tough enough?" "I am still here, aren't I?" He smiled slightly. "And so are you. You lost everything, but you are sitting here alive and whole. That takes toughness." Margaret had never thought of herself as tough. She had always been the quiet one, the careful one, the girl who followed the rules and did what was expected. But maybe Nathan was right. Maybe survival itself was a kind of strength. The days passed, and the snow began to melt. Margaret and Nathan fell into an easy partnership. She cooked and managed the house while he worked on the ranch, repairing winter damage and preparing for spring. Sometimes she would go out and help him, feeding the chickens or helping move supplies, and Nathan would teach her things about ranch life. How to read the weather, how to handle the horses, how to watch for signs of predators or sickness in the livestock. "You are a quick learner," Nathan said one afternoon as they worked together to fix a fence rail that had cracked in the cold. "Most people from the city would be useless out here, but you are not afraid to work." "I have never been afraid of work," Margaret said, "and I like learning new things. It makes me feel less helpless." "You are not helpless." Nathan hammered in a nail with sure strikes. "You are just out of your element. There is a difference." As winter began to give way to early spring, Margaret found herself thinking less about Sacramento and her sister's boarding house and more about the life she was living here. She and Nathan had developed a comfortable routine, but it was more than that. She enjoyed his company. He was quiet and steady, but when he spoke, he said things worth hearing. He listened when she talked, really listened, and asked thoughtful questions. He made her laugh with dry observations about the chickens or his horses. And sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and wondering. One evening, about 6 weeks after the fire, they were sitting by the fire after dinner when Nathan said, "The roads should be clear enough for travel in another week or 2. Margaret's hand stilled on the sock she was darning. "Oh, that is good. Is it?" Nathan was looking at her intently. "Is that what you want, to keep going to California?" Margaret set down her sewing. "I do not know. I have no money for passage. I would have to work my way there somehow, and I do not know how long that would take. You could stay here." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's heart started beating faster. "Stay, as my wife, if you would have me." Nathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know this is not what you planned, but I have come to care for you, Margaret. More than I expected to. You have made this place feel like a home, not just a house, and I think, maybe, you have come to care for me too." Margaret could not speak for a moment. She had come to care for him, she realized. Somewhere in the past weeks, Nathan had become important to her. She looked forward to seeing him at the end of the day, to talking with him, to working alongside him. The thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, made her chest tight. "I do care for you," she said quietly. "But Nathan, I have nothing to bring to a marriage. No dowry, no belongings, nothing. You would be getting a wife who is completely dependent on you. You bring yourself, and that is worth more than any dowry. You are smart and capable and kind. You work hard. You have made my life better in every way since you came here. That is what I care about." Nathan reached across and took her hand. His palm was warm and rough, and his grip was gentle. "I am not asking you to decide right now. Think about it. But know that I would be honored to have you as my wife if you would have me as your husband." Margaret looked down at their joined hands. She thought about her plans to go to California to work in her sister's boarding house. She tried to imagine that life and found she could not quite picture it. But she could easily picture staying here, building a life with Nathan, working together to make this ranch prosper. She could see children playing in the yard, could see herself growing old in this cabin with this man who had saved her life and given her shelter and asked for nothing in return. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I will marry you." Nathan's face transformed. The seriousness gave way to a smile so bright and genuine that it made him look years younger. He stood and pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they just stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other. Then Nathan leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful as if she might break. Margaret kissed him back, feeling something settle into place in her chest. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. They were married 3 weeks later in Desdemona, Texas, the small town about 15 miles south of Nathan's ranch. The preacher was an elderly man who performed the ceremony in his small church, with 2 witnesses pulled in from the general store. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Nathan bought for her, simple blue cotton that suited her coloring. Nathan wore his best shirt and pants, his hair neatly combed, looking both proud and nervous. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Nathan kissed her in front of God and witnesses, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had set out from Kansas City planning to start a new life, and she had found one, just not the one she had expected. Sometimes, she thought, the best things came from the worst disasters. They stayed in town that night at the small hotel, a luxury Nathan insisted on. Their wedding night was tender and a little awkward, both of them new to this intimacy, but there was love in it and care. Nathan was patient and gentle, and Margaret felt safe with him in a way she had never felt with anyone else. They returned to the ranch the next day, and Margaret threw herself into making it truly a home. She planted a garden with seeds Nathan bought from town, started a project to sew curtains for the windows, and began planning additions to the cabin. Nathan had already been working on building a separate bedroom, wanting to give them privacy and space for the future. "We will need room for children," he said, measuring wood for the new wall. "How many do you want?" "I do not know," Margaret said, laughing at the directness of the question. "How many do you want?" "4 or 5, maybe. I came from a big family. It gets loud, but it is never lonely." Margaret thought about a house full of children, dark-haired and gray-eyed like their father, and felt a flutter of anticipation. "Then we will plan for that." The spring and summer were busy times. Nathan worked from dawn until after dark, tending the cattle and horses, improving the buildings, preparing for the next winter. Margaret worked alongside him when she could, learning more about ranch life every day. She discovered she had a talent for handling the horses, and Nathan let her take over much of their daily care. She also proved to be good at the business side of things, keeping careful records of expenses and earnings, planning purchases and sales with an eye for economy. "You should have been a banker," Nathan teased one evening as she tallied up figures in her careful handwriting. "I like this better," Margaret said. "It is real. I can see the results of the work." By late summer, Margaret was pregnant. She told Nathan on a warm evening in August, and he picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, laughing with pure joy. He became even more protective after that, insisting she not lift heavy things or work too hard, until Margaret had to put her foot down. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said firmly. "Women have been having babies and working through it since the dawn of time. I will not be an invalid for 9 months. Nathan backed down, but he still worried, she could tell. He made sure she had the best food, insisted she rest in the afternoons, and started working on a proper cradle with his own hands, carving it from good oak wood. Their son was born in the spring of 1876, on a day when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie and the sky was impossibly blue. The birth was hard, attended by a midwife from town who stayed with them for 3 days. Nathan paced outside like a caged animal until the midwife finally opened the door and told him he had a son. He came in to find Margaret exhausted but smiling, holding a red-faced, squalling baby with a shock of dark hair. Nathan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He is perfect," Nathan whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you." They named him James after Margaret's father, and he became the center of their world. Nathan was a devoted father, patient and playful, and Margaret loved watching them together. As James grew from infant to toddler, Nathan would take him out to see the animals, carrying him on his shoulders, teaching him the names of things. Margaret would watch from the porch, her hands on her growing belly, because by the time James was a year old, she was pregnant again. Their second child was a daughter, born in the winter of 1877. They named her Rose, and she had Margaret's dark hair and Nathan's gray eyes. She was quieter than James had been, more observant, and Nathan doted on her shamelessly. "I am not going to be able to say no to her when she is older, am I?" Nathan said one night, holding baby Rose while she slept against his chest. "Probably not," Margaret agreed, smiling. "But I will keep you both in line." The years flowed by in a rhythm of seasons and work and growth. The ranch prospered as Nathan's careful management paid off. They acquired more cattle, improved the buildings, bought more land. Margaret's garden expanded into a substantial vegetable plot that provided most of their food through the summer and fall. She learned to preserve and can, to smoke meat, to do all the things necessary to survive on a ranch far from town. James started helping with the ranch work as soon as he was old enough, tagging after his father with solemn determination. Rose proved to have a gift with animals, able to gentle even the most skittish horse with patience and a soft voice. 2 more children followed, Thomas in 1879 and Sarah in 1881. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all, with Nathan building on rooms as they needed them. Through it all, Margaret and Nathan's love deepened. They had their disagreements, of course. Nathan could be stubborn about his way of doing things, and Margaret had her own strong opinions. But they had learned to talk through their problems, to compromise, to remember what mattered most. Every night, after the children were in bed, they would sit together by the fire and talk about the day, about plans and dreams and small worries. Nathan would hold her hand or she would lean against his shoulder, and Margaret would think about the night her wagon burned, about how she had stood in the snow with nothing, and how that disaster had led her here, to this life, to this man, to this family. On their 10th anniversary, Nathan gave her a new ring to wear alongside her mother's. It was simple gold, but inside he had it engraved, "To Margaret, who made me whole." Margaret cried when she read it, and Nathan kissed away her tears. "I mean it," he said. "Before you, I was just surviving. You taught me how to live. You saved my life," Margaret said. "In every way possible. We saved each other." As the years continued, their children grew and the ranch thrived. James eventually married a girl from town, a smart young woman named Catherine who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far edge of the property, and James took over much of the daily ranch work, giving Nathan more time to focus on expansion and planning. Rose surprised them all by announcing she wanted to be a teacher, and Nathan and Margaret supported her through the training, proud beyond words when she opened a small school in Desdemona. Thomas and Sarah were still young, but already showing their own strengths and interests. Thomas loved working with his hands, building and fixing things with the same careful attention Nathan had always shown. Sarah had her mother's gift with a needle and thread, and was already making beautiful quilts and embroidered pieces that drew admiration from everyone who saw them. On a warm evening in the spring of 1890, Nathan and Margaret sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. They were both in their early 40s now, their dark hair touched with gray, their faces lined by years of sun and work and laughter. But their hands were still clasped together, fingers intertwined. "You ever think about that night?" Nathan asked. "The night I found you?" "Sometimes," Margaret said. "I think about how frightened I was, how I thought my life was over. It was just beginning. I know that now." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I lost everything that night, but I gained so much more. You, the children, this life. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the fire?" Nathan asked with a slight smile. Margaret considered that seriously. "Not even the fire. If that had not happened, I would never have met you. I would have gone to California, worked in my sister's boarding house, probably married some merchant or clerk and had a perfectly fine life. But I would not have had this. I would not have had you." Nathan lifted her hand and kissed it, a gesture he had done 1,000 times over the years. "I love you, Margaret Moss, more today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. And I love you, Nathan Moss, forever and always." They sat together as the stars came out, comfortable in the silence, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. The ranch was their legacy, but it was not the most important thing they had built. They had built a family, a home, a life full of love and purpose. They had built something that would last. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family. Sarah was practicing her sewing, the soft sound of her humming carried on the night air. Thomas was reading aloud to the younger children from the family, telling them stories of their grandparents, keeping the memory alive. These were the moments that mattered, Margaret thought. Not the grand gestures or dramatic events, but these quiet times of peace and connection. As the years continued to pass, Nathan and Margaret watched their children have children of their own. James and Catherine had 3 boys who loved the ranch as much as their grandfather did. Rose married a fellow teacher, a gentle man named Peter, and they had twin girls who were as bright and curious as their mother. Thomas found love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, uniting 2 families and 2 pieces of land. Sarah married late, choosing carefully, and found happiness with a craftsman from town who appreciated her artistic talents. Nathan and Margaret became the center of a growing family, their home the gathering place for holidays and celebrations. Margaret cooked vast meals with Sarah's help, feeding 3 generations around a table Nathan had built to accommodate everyone. Nathan would sit at the head of that table, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and catch Margaret's eye across the chaos, and they would share a smile that held decades of love and partnership. In the fall of 1898, on a day when the leaves were turning gold, and the air had that particular clarity that comes with autumn, Nathan and Margaret took a ride together out to the place where her wagon had burned so many years ago. They had not been back there in decades, but somehow they both felt the need to see it again. The landscape had changed. The road was better maintained now, and there was a farmhouse visible in the distance where once there had been empty prairie. But they could still find the spot, marked by a few pieces of rusted metal half buried in the earth. They stood there together, holding hands, remembering. 23 years ago, Margaret said softly. It feels like yesterday and like a lifetime ago all at once. You were so brave, Nathan said. Standing there in the snow, everything gone, and you did not fall apart. You just kept going. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. Bravery is not about not being afraid. It is about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Nathan turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. You have been the bravest person I know, Margaret. You took a chance on a life you had not planned with a man you barely knew, and you made it into something beautiful. Everything I am, everything we have built, I owe to you. We built it together, Margaret said firmly. I could not have done any of this without you. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You gave me love when I did not even know I needed it. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me everything. Nathan pulled her close, and they stood there in the place where their story began, holding each other, grateful beyond words for the path their lives had taken. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, side by side as they had been for more than 2 decades. The house was lit up, windows glowing warm in the twilight, and they could see figures moving inside. Their family, their legacy. Margaret and Nathan unsaddled the horses together, working with the easy coordination of long practice. Then they walked to the house, hands clasped, ready for whatever the evening would bring. The years ahead were kinder than many could hope for. Nathan and Margaret both lived to see their great-grandchildren, to watch their family spread and grow like a strong tree with deep roots. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1906, surrounded by more than 60 family members, all of them descended from or connected to the union that began the night a wagon burned in the snow. At the party, James stood and made a toast. He was in his 30s now, a respected rancher in his own right, but when he looked at his parents, his voice was full of emotion. To my mother and father, he said, raising his glass, who taught us all what love looks like, what commitment means, what it means to build something that lasts. Everything we have, everything we are, comes from you. Thank you for showing us the way. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as everyone drank the toast. Nathan squeezed her hand, and she knew he was feeling the same overwhelming gratitude and joy. They lived out their days on the ranch they had built together. Nathan passed first, on a quiet morning in 1913, with Margaret holding his hand and all their children gathered around. His last words were, "Take care of each other. Remember that love is what matters." Margaret followed him 3 years later in the spring of 1916. She was 72 years old, surrounded by family, and her last thoughts were of Nathan, of their life together, of the night he found her in the snow and saved her. She had no regrets, only gratitude for every moment they had shared. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a big oak tree Nathan had planted the year they were married. The headstones were simple. Nathan Moss, beloved husband and father, and Margaret Moss, beloved wife and mother. But the words carved below told the real story. Together forever. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from James to his children and their children after them. The story of how Nathan and Margaret met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The night the wagon burned in the snow. The cowboy who gave her shelter and supplies and, eventually, his heart. The love that grew from disaster, that proved stronger than hardship or time. And on winter nights, when the snow fell heavy and the wind howled around the ranch house, the descendants of Nathan and Margaret Moss would gather by the fire, and someone would tell the story again. About bravery and chance and love. About a woman who lost everything and gained the world. About a man who had everything and found the one thing he had been missing. About two people who found each other in the most unlikely way and built a legacy that would last forever. The story always ended the same way, with a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. That disaster can be the doorway to blessing. That love, real love, is worth every risk, every sacrifice, every leap of faith. And in the telling and the retelling, Nathan and Margaret lived on, their love story never ending, passed down through the generations like a precious gift, reminding everyone who heard it that true love, once found, lasts forever.